All right, so let's talk about output parameters. So, we've talked about the profiles. We've talked about the characteristics of the devices, etc. And we need to talk a little bit about print output parameters. And before I mentioned that a profile really does define a specific printing condition. And in this case, if we talk about output intent, this is something that actually is to describe what you anticipate the output to be. Now, so for example, if I have a digital press, and I told you before that there was this characterization of this digital press that took the form of a profile, right? That was the way to actually kind of consolidate the information around that device. And I had that. How do I then do a number of things? First of all, if I'm a printer and I've got this device and I know what the characterization is, how does the person who is going to be designing this know what I'm going to be printing it on? Well, I guess I could probably give them the profile and say, here, this is what I'm doing, but that's not practical, because it's not practical because if I'm a designer, first of all, when I'm designing this, I don't know which printer it's going to. I don't know which machine they're going to be putting it on. So all I can do is I can say, well, as a designer, this is what I want it to look like, and basically design and define a specific printing condition. And in many cases, those are things like standards, okay? You've heard the term SWAP or FOGRA 27 or GRACL. Those are standardized output intents, and they define a very specific set of conditions that you can use as a designer when you're creating something to actually communicate through the process what you are anticipating and expecting your final output to look like. Now, one of the beauties of a PDFX file, and one of the key components of a PDFX file, and that enables it to be a great blind transfer device or format, is that it must include an output intent. Because if I just give somebody a PDF file and I don't know what they're anticipating and what they're expecting when I go to produce it as a printer, chances are I'm not going to give them exactly what they're looking for. So a PDFX file must include an output intent, just like it must include fonts and font information. And as I said before, the output intent contains the name of the output condition and as well as or the information around what that output condition is. And basically what it does is it allows you to facilitate automated production and blind transfers. Now, that having been said, when we're dealing with things like profiles and output intents, there are a number of problems or potential problems that exist in terms of the way the Adobe suite, which is the primary suite that people use for doing creative work, is constructed. And it's not that they did it to confuse you, they actually did it to give you more control. The problem is it can get very confusing for people. So if you look at any Adobe application, primarily InDesign, Photoshop, etc., you're going to notice that there are really 2 points of control as it relates to color. The first is in color settings. And color settings, that's usually defined, or you find that in the edit menu of the application, and you go to color settings, and there it is, and this is what you're going to see. And pretty much what that does is it defines a number of things. It defines, first of all, it defines working spaces. It defines what you as a designer of a document is going, the working space you're going to be working in. So for example, in this case, You can notice that the working space for RGB is sRGB. The working space for CMYK is ISO coded V2. And yes, you can change the working space. You can make it bigger. You can, because sRGB tends to be a little smaller as it relates to potential RGB spaces, and you could have a different CMYK space as well. But you need to understand that whatever you set this at is going to be or can be used as a way to convert files later, which we'll be talking about that, and create potential problems. Now, remember before I said that, and the color management policies is a very, very, very important, plays a very important role here. Remember before I said every device has different characteristics. So if I have a digital camera, and my digital camera is using a profile of a specific characterization of that device, and I don't preserve that information, I stand the risk of doing the conversion right now. So I could basically wind up, I can have this beautiful, very wide gamut color photograph that I've taken, and if my working space was sRGB, when I imported that image into this application, InDesign or Photoshop or whatever it is, it would actually transform that device color space, that wide color space, into a narrow one, in this case sRGB. So it's usually very important, just preserve the embedded profiles of those devices. Now, that's great for something like RGB. In the case of a CMYK, well, then we have a potential problem, because if there was a CMYK profile in the image that I'm importing, and I preserve the profile and not the numbers, I'm going to have a very similar kind of a problem, where I'm going to do a translation, and I'm going to take it one step further. I'm not only going to have a problem with it, but if I have just a black only, like a black drop shadow or something like that, it's going to wind up doing that transform, and my black drop shadow is now going to become a 3-color drop shadow or a 4-color drop shadow. So preserving, in the case of the CMYK, we don't want to preserve the profile. What we want to do, we want to ignore the profile, but we want to preserve the numbers, the CMYK numbers. And those are very key components in terms of the actual processing. In terms of the conversion options, whether you're using the Adobe engine, which I would recommend, or the native operating system and color engine, whether you're working in Windows or you're working in a Mac environment. The Adobe engine is probably the safest, just because it's there, and you don't even have to think about it. And in terms of the intent itself, the relative color metric is probably the safest intent for you to use. I can't go into a lot of detail on that today, because that's actually, maybe we'll do that in a future seminar if people are interested in getting into the weeds. But in terms of getting these settings right, one of the things that the GWG does, the Get Work Group does, is we actually have setting files that you can download that pretty much allow you to just choose the setting file itself from the drop-down menu, and it fills in all the rest of that to make your life a little bit easier. Okay, now we deal with the other side of it. Okay, so now we've got it in. We haven't done, we've tried to preserve the information as we're creating of the files that are coming in our application. We're trying not to convert them when we bring them into the application, because we want to try and keep the spaces as big as we possibly can throughout the process. So now we want to export it to and create a PDF. And you'll notice again, with the Get Work Group, we have a number of export settings that you can use. In this case, this is the GWG 2015, which means it's PDFX4, and you can see that below it, with CMYK and RGB and layers. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too. with at 350 PPI or DPI. So it's got a good. We're going to create a good export and support a nice high resolution, etc. Now, in this first window, which is the general window, you notice I circled the visible and printable layers. And the reason I did that is because increasingly layers are very important in PDFX files, especially in automated production. It's very much important if you're dealing with a lot of different types of languages, etc. And it allows you to keep those layers and move them from InDesign or from Illustrator to Acrobat, and so that they can be viewed and processed down the line. So we tend to turn that on in this specific setting. In terms of resolution and downsampling, I'm not going to tell you or presume to tell you what your specific requirements are, your output requirements are. But again, if you chose the right preset, that's great for what it is. And we've tried it through the Gantt work group to create presets based on application requirements. For example, if I'm going to create a billboard, I don't know that I need 350 DPI, and the file would be humongous. On the other hand, if I'm going to create a nice high resolution print, I may want 350 DPI because it may have a lot of fine detail, or I may only need 300. In this case, you can either communicate with your PSP or just use the presets that we've set based on applications, which makes it a lot easier for you. In terms of marks, this is really a preference setting. If you need marks for proofs, that's very good. If you're working in an automated imposition, the PDF actually contains the information, the crop information, the bleed information, without putting the marks in there. It's in there. If it was in the document, it gets communicated through the PDF to the imposition software and to the final output DFE. Now, this is very important. This is the output tab, and the output tab of the export really is where you can make or break everything we've just talked about in the past with regard to the color settings. Ideally, you don't want to do color conversion here. The reason you don't want to do color conversion here and you want to leave that up to the final output device is because you don't know what the output device is. You don't know that the output device, what press it's going to go on necessarily, or if you do know what press it's going to go on, what media it's going to be using. And it's better for the actual color conversion to happen at the DFE, at the output device, at the last possible minute, because that way there should be all that good information that we've been putting into this PDF file, all the wide color space, wide color gamut stuff, all the CMYK information that we've put in here, all of that can be passed through to the DFE and it can process it. Now, if it's a PDFX, you'll notice that we have the output intent that we talked about before. If you have that output intent in there, the DFE is smart enough to know that, okay, this is what they're expecting. So I know, based on what this information is, I know how to process that information. Now, if I'm a printer, if I'm a print service provider, I have some control at this point once it gets to my DFE, and we'll talk about that actually when we get to talking about DFEs. Fonts and flattening. If you are using PDFX4, you'll notice that the transparency can't be flattened in this, and it shouldn't be. Transparency, flattening, or processing as Steve was talking about before with transparency, et cetera, should really be handled at the DFE. If you use PDFX 1A, and you see that there's a transparency, again, if you're using PDFX 1A, which we don't recommend, because that's that CMYK we talked about before. But if you're using it, you may have the option, it won't be grayed out, to flatten the transparency here. Opt not to flatten it. If you flatten the transparency, you're basically tied the hands of the printer, and you stand or run the risk of getting anomalies where the flattening actually occurred. So where some of the vector art and the raster art come together, that's where you start to see things like, we used to call them zippers, or you see little white lines. So that's what we don't want to flatten it here. Let the DFE do the flattening.